So, why is it that your time is just like a Swiss alpine meadow? Well, a couple of years ago, my sister moved to a lovely little town in a valley in the Alps of Switzerland. So it's a place where there's local ski season tourism, summer tourism, local industry, retail, and it's all interspersed by fairly traditional grazing-based farming. And those farms come right up to the outskirts of town. Now, I was lucky enough to visit my sister in this beautiful place earlier this year. It was early spring and the snow had just melted in the valley and the green grass was emerging. And the farmers were starting to move their cows out of the stables where they'd been over winter and onto that green grass. And they're also starting to spread the manure from the stables over the grass as well. That's something anyone who had a functioning nose couldn't fail to notice, although it wasn't that unpleasant. Now, my sister told me that later in the season, once all the snow had melted on the Alps further up and the grass grew there, those cows would be herded up to those alpine grazing pastures where they'd stay and graze until they came back down to their stables for winter. And this is something they've been doing for centuries. Now, I knew that just a few years ago, alpine grazing in the Australian high country had been banned because of the destruction caused by cattle. So naturally, my question to my sister was, what is it the Swiss do to prevent this destruction of their alpine grazing commons? My sister didn't really know. She thought there was some sort of traditional way of doing things amongst the farming families, and there was some sort of committee in the village. This reminded me of an essay I'd once read entitled The Tragedy of the Commons. It was written by an American professor of biology, Garrett Hardin, back in the 60s. And the basic concept of the tragedy of the commons is not new. It goes something like this. So if we imagine a medieval town common, so a patch of grass somewhere on the outskirts of town for common use. Now, farmer can bring a cow there to graze on the way to market. If there's enough grass there for 10 cows and 10 farmers all want to use it and they all put one cow on the common, then there's enough grass for all and all those cows fatten nicely and all is well. But it's in every farmer's own interest to maximise what he does with that common, and it might be perfectly rational for a farmer, say Farmer Jones, to put another cow on the common. So Farmer Jones puts another cow on the common, now there's 11 cows, only enough grass for 10, and so the result is all those cows don't get quite enough to eat, and so they don't fatten so well. But Farmer Jones has 2 moderately fat cows, and so he's better off for it, even though his fellow farmers are slightly well less off. But all the farmers are astute businessmen, so they all get 2 cows and put it on the common. And so there's 20 cows, but still only enough grass for 10 cows. And the result is that all those cows quickly starve. So if the farmers are left to use that common however they want, making seemingly rational decisions in their own best interest, the result is that the common is ruined for all, and all of the farmers end up the losers, as do the local village people because they miss out on the milk. So the lesson is that any common that is in demand must be regulated, otherwise it is doomed to be ruined. And that is the tragedy of the commons. And so I did a bit of research and I found that the Swiss farmers had clearly known about this potential for tragedy for centuries, and they had a comprehensive set of rules and obligations for the use of those alpine commons. Now, each village does it slightly differently, but typically grazing rights are restricted to a limited number of families or farmers. There's strict limits on the number of cows that are allowed to be grazed on those pastures. Rates are paid to manage the pastures and provide policing. There's obligations placed on the farmers to clean up and manage the pastures. And there's penalties applied if the farmers breach stocking rates or fail in those obligations. And so the alpine grazing common is not ruined because rights are restricted and those rights come with obligations. Now you'll notice there's not necessarily any special fairness to the way those grazing rights are allocated. Hereditary rights aren't fair if you happen to be born into the wrong family. But protection of the common is more important. And it's also not as simple as educating the farmers. In this case, self-regulation won't work because it's in each farmer's interest to try and graze as many cows up there as he can. So the temptation to cheat is too high. And from an individual farmer's point of view, putting more cows up there and cheating is a perfectly rational decision. Now, when I thought about this concept of the commons, I realised that it applied way more broadly than just some grazing Swiss cows. And so, with every common also comes the risk of tragedy unless the commons is properly regulated. And this is the bit that interested me because, of course, it also follows that as soon as a common is recognised and it's in demand, it's clear what must be done. There needs to be an appropriate level of governance put in place, and any rights to access need to be restricted, and they need to come with obligations. And so, looking through this prism of the common provides a guide to action. It dictates what is the correct course of action and also dictates what is a dereliction of duty. Now, if we hear of a business speaking about self-regulation or a government talking about deregulation, perhaps the first thing we should be asking is, which common is it that's being exposed to tragedy? And whose benefit? And more importantly, to whose loss? So a common is a resource that more than one party has interest in or demands on, and most commons will be of more interest to those who are mentally or physically closer, that is the local community. Of course, there are commons where the local community don't realise they have an interest, even though they do have an interest. And a common, interestingly, doesn't have to be a physical thing, and it doesn't have to be a natural resource. For example, roads are a common. Now, roads are totally man-made, but once they're created, they're a common, and loads of people want access to them, but they need to be regulated. Imagine if anyone could drive any size vehicle at whatever speed they wanted on whatever side of the road they wanted. Wouldn't work. My private driveway, however, is private property, and so it's not a common. And I can drive on whatever side of the road I want on my private driveway. So privatising is a way of removing the common. But of course it doesn't necessarily totally remove the community's interest. And all commons need to be regulated. But education and self-regulation, it cannot be relied upon. So look, I know that we need to stop burning so much fossil fuel and polluting the common of the global atmosphere. I know that. But it hasn't stopped me driving my car. Because driving my car is way too convenient for me, so I haven't stopped even though I know I should. No. What I need is restrictions. I need to be coerced. And of course I need to be taxed. Of course I need to be taxed. If I want the right to pollute a common that's owned by all, make me pay for it. Because not everyone can have unlimited polluting rights. So make those who want to pollute pay for it. And what's more, I'll accept that regulation if I know that all of you also accept that regulation. And of course, also if I know there's a policeman looking over my shoulder. And that's true of the management of all commons. So once I defined the common for myself, I started seeing them everywhere. So I've already just mentioned the global atmosphere. So the atmosphere is a common that we all need access to, as do all the other species with which we share the planet. And so the whole argument about restricting carbon dioxide emissions is really one about access to that common. Restrictions and obligations. Unlimited polluting rights doesn't work. And fisheries. Now, less than 50 years ago, whales were hunted in the world's oceans with very little restrictions. And the result was that many species of whales were tragically brought close to the brink of extinction. Restrictions and obligations, unlimited fishing rights, doesn't work. And guns in the USA. Now, the safety of a community space, such as the safety at a concert, is something we all want to share. It's a common of public safety. Now, in many states in the United States, citizens have a right to own and carry guns with very little restriction. This is held out as a God-given freedom. But we know that the tragic result of this unfettered freedom is that an American person is more than 10 times more likely to die from gun violence than an Australian person. So the unfettered freedom of the individual has dramatically reduced the freedom of the broader community. It has tragically degraded the common. Restrictions and obligations, unlimited freedoms in a public space doesn't work. And of course, the kitchen sink. That's right. The kitchen sink, everyone wants to dump their plates there, their glasses, their cups. So the kitchen sink is a common as well. And to control the self-interested behaviour of access to that common, there needs to be rules applied to dumping rights. And those dumping rights need to come with clean-up obligations. And of course, there needs to be a good parental policeman overseeing that sink. Restrictions and obligations, unlimited sink dumping rights, doesn't work. And so commons are everywhere. And we all rely on access to many and the good function of many others for us to live our lives. So from the kitchen sink to the global atmosphere and out into space, these are the shared resources that all bring communities together. They are the things that connect us. But as I hope I've shown, they won't look after themselves. So as attractive as the dream may appear, unlimited freedom cannot work. So to avoid tragedy, my freedom can't come with the attitude I will do as I damn well please and sod the rest of you. That's disconnection. So for it to work for all of us, we all need to submit to regulation, and we all need to acknowledge that our rights come with obligations. But we can all accept those restrictions and obligations if we know that everyone else is doing it. That way it feels fair. And this way we maximise the rights and the freedoms of the community as a whole. But none of this happens by chance. And so, of course, by now, you all understand that your time is indeed just like a Swiss alpine meadow, right? No. Well, why is it in this time of abundance, when machines do most of the work for us, are people still stressed and time poor? Well, the prism of the common once again shows us why. So time is a limited resource. It's a common. So time itself isn't a common, but your personal 24 hours of the day most certainly is. And there are loads of things that want access to it. There's your kids, there's your partner, there's your boss, there's your workmates, your clients, your friends, cooking, washing, cleaning, emails, tweets, FaceTime, text. So your time is a common too. And yes, like any common, if there's excessive and unregulated access, then it's doomed to be degraded. And you no longer have enough of that time for your own needs. So at work, your boss or your clients probably manage what you do with your time. And they pay you for access to that time common. But once you're outside paid work, your time common is probably up for grabs. And so it is at risk of degradation. Restrictions and obligations, unlimited access to your personal time doesn't work. But now I'm going to voluntarily restrict my access to your time. But thank you for the time that you did give me.